Pope Julius II was, by every account, a nightmare of a client, a warrior pope who preferred armour to vestments and treated artists the way generals treat conscripts. He wanted a ceiling, while Michelangelo at the time wanted to be left alone with a mountain of marble in Carrara so he could finish Julius's tomb. Instead, in 1508, he got yanked off that project and shoved onto scaffolding 40 feet in the air to paint a ceiling handed to him with no way out. There was a rumour in Rome, and this one has legs, that the whole commission was orchestrated by Michelangelo's rival, the architect Bramante, who allegedly whispered in the Pope's ear that this would be the perfect way to humiliate the sculptor and expose him as an amateur outside his medium. If true, the plan backfired so spectacularly that it's almost funny. Michelangelo spent 4 years contorted on a custom-built platform, standing and craning his neck upward for hours. Fresco was foreign to him going in, but he taught himself the technique mid-commission, tore out an entire section early on after mould ruined it, and fired his whole team of assistants at one point, convinced he could manage alone. And he did, my friends. Who would even doubt him? Not only he painted the whole Genesis on the ceiling, but he also smuggled a few secrets, which was his style of humour. Adam's body is complete, and Michelangelo is painting the instant consciousness or soul gets switched on. God makes a man and then switches him on. Pretty cool, right? But there is a hidden detail. Look just beneath God's left arm, tucked into the crook of it, half-shielded, staring past Adam, almost directly out at you. There's a figure there, wide-eyed, that most scholars identify as Eve, pre-creation, already conceptually present in God's mind. The figure carries an androgynous quality art historians have chewed on for a century. Soft, almost adolescent features. Some readings expand this figure beyond Eve alone into a kind of proto-humanity, undifferentiated, sexless, holding the entire human future the way an acorn holds the oak. So the composition ends up staging this weirdly literal metaphysics, woman as idea, already inside cognition, pre-existing as concept, versus man as body, inert clay on a hillside, dependent on an external act to be activated at all. It flips the Genesis order on its head visually, even while the Genesis order, Adam first, Eve from his rib later, is technically what the wall text says is happening. The painting is quietly arguing with its own source material. In 1990, a physician named Frank Lynn Meshberger published a paper in the Journal of the American Medical Association, pointing out that the red cloak billowing around God and his flock of angels forms, anatomically, an almost frighteningly precise cross-section of the human brain. You can trace the folds, cerebellum, the pituitary stalk, and even the frontal lobe. It's all there. Once you see it, it stays seen like an optical illusion. Look at the ceiling. In the middle of all that fury and improvisation sits a single panel, roughly 1/3 of the way through the ceiling's 9 central narrative scenes from Genesis, one that went on to outlive the Pope, the church politics and religion's monopoly on the image itself. Adam and God reaching towards each other. There's about 1.5 inches of bare plaster between God's index finger and Adam's. That gap is a deliberate design choice, built into the composition from the very start. Michelangelo constructed the whole scene around that negative space. Compare it to Genesis, where God forms Adam's body from dust with his hands and breathes life directly into him. Michelangelo trades that intimacy for tension, the longing, the moment just before. If the fingers touched, this would read as a completed action. A done deal, static, closed. Instead, you get the millisecond before contact, the spark still waiting to jump, and your eye instinctively tries to close the gap yourself. You lean in, you want it to happen. Michelangelo weaponized anticipation 5 centuries before anyone had a word for suspense as a design principle. It's the same trick a good thriller writer uses to keep you turning pages. Withhold the resolution, and the reader does half your work for you, filling the silence with their own need. There's also a theological reading a lot of casual viewers miss. Adam looks almost bored, his arm is limp, his wrist relaxed, his whole body draped in the languid, half-formed posture of something still incomplete because he is. He has form, and the spirit arrives next. God, by contrast, is compressed with a coiled, muscular urgency, his cloak snapping like a sail caught in impossible wind that heaven, by every law of physics, produces anyway. The difference in energy between the two figures is the theological point. Matter stays inert until the divine spark reaches it. Another anatomy. Detail few people talk about is Adam's belly button. Adam has a strange claim to a navel by strict theological logic. Clay-formed rather than birth-formed, with an umbilical cord that should have skipped him entirely. And yet look closely. A small navel-like indentation sits on his abdomen. Generations of theologians and art nerds have argued over whether Michelangelo painted an anatomically standard torso purely out of habit or made a deliberate, almost cheeky, theological statement. Suggesting Adam arrived already bearing the mark of humanity, a symbol connecting him to every human born afterward. Umbilical history retroactively written onto the first man's skin. Fast forward to the 1980s and 90s, when the Vatican undertook a massive cleaning of the entire Sistine ceiling, and the art world nearly had a collective breakdown. For centuries, everyone had assumed Michelangelo's palette was somber, muted, moody, all warm browns and shadowy earth tones, the effect of old varnish and centuries of candle soot. Then the restorers started removing layers of grime, animal glue, and botched touch-ups from later restorers. And underneath sat a riot of colour that caught everyone off guard. Acid greens, hot pinks, sherbet oranges. Michelangelo grew up steeped in the intellectual circle of the Medici court in Florence, where the dominant philosophical current ran closer to Renaissance Neoplatonism than to strict medieval Catholicism. The idea, filtering down from thinkers like Marsilio Ficino, that the physical world serves as a kind of shadow or reflection of a higher, perfect, spiritual reality, and that the human soul amounts to divine material, held temporarily in flesh, yearning to return to its source. Look at the creation of Adam again with that lens on. Adam's body is idealized to the point of near perfection, modeled, many scholars believe, partly on ancient Greco-Roman sculpture that Michelangelo studied obsessively. It's Neoplatonism made visible. The human body is the closest earthly echo of divine form, physical beauty as evidence of spiritual truth rather than a distraction from it. God gives Adam more than breath in this image. He gives him the spark that lets that already beautiful, already sculptural body participate in the divine, closing the gap between matter and spirit that the whole Neoplatonic worldview obsessed over. Strip away the theology, the philosophy, the anatomical Easter eggs, the 500-year-old gossip about Bramante's alleged sabotage, and an image remains that does something remarkably few other artworks in history have managed. It makes the moment of almost more powerful than the moment of already. Humans stay obsessed with beginnings, and Michelangelo gave us the beginning of beginnings, frozen an eyelash width before completion. Forever. That's why it gets parodied, referenced and stolen by everything from cereal commercials to sci-fi movie posters to phone charger jokes. And it still holds up. A gap resists cheapening. The moment you close it, the magic drains away. Which is exactly why Michelangelo kept the fingers apart, and exactly why 600 years later we're all still leaning in, waiting for the spark to jump.